Good morning, South Hills. It is great to be here today. I know I was already on this stage one time, but I don't know how else to start talking when I'm streaming online. I'm still figuring this out. It's only 3 months in. You can't expect me to have this all figured out already. So I love that Janina said that her favorite thing about church is the crazy things that happen in my life. One of the questions that I would like to start off with today, and maybe Janina will get a kick out of this, is, you know, realistically, as we look over the last few months, it's been almost 3 months that we've been in quarantine and kind of social distancing, isolating, things like that. It's been crazy. 2020 as a whole has been crazy. There's all kinds of stuff that's gone on, and then the last few weeks, obviously, there's been so much tension. It's been incredibly challenging, and some of us, like myself, we're feelers and we're very emotional, and so honestly, I've just felt like a huge weight over the last few weeks, especially of just like a lot of the angst and the pain that's happening and that people are feeling in our country. And so we find ourselves asking these questions, questions like, if God really cared, then why would he allow that? Um, if God was really loving, then why is there so much hate? This last week, one of the questions that I've been thinking about a lot is that if God really loved me, then why would he allow somebody to steal my car? Because that's what happened about a week and a half ago. And that was a question that I had, just like, man, God, that's frustrating. And it's an older car. I wasn't too emotionally attached to it, but it's just a weird feeling. And then when the police called and they let me know that they found my car, I was curious why God would allow somebody to steal my car and then paint it Dodger blue. Like just the worst thing you could it's like you already took it. You already destroyed it, but then you couldn't even do like angel red. You had to go Dodger blue. We have very serious questions about why God allows certain things to happen. So obviously, I'm playing around a little bit, trying to bring a little bit of levity because it's been so difficult. I'm not playing around that my car is Dodger blue and in a tow yard somewhere. That's a real story. It's all worked out. We're fine. But we ask these questions. Why would a good God allow bad things to happen? We've all asked these kind of questions. Um, why would he, if he is loving, if he is good, if he's kind, then why would he allow bad things to happen? Why would he allow pain or suffering or evil to exist? There's a dissonance that many of us wrestle with. And if we're honest, when we ask this question, we always ask this question like, why would God allow the bad things out there to happen? Why would he allow the evil in the world to happen? Why would he allow the suffering and the mistakes and all of that stuff out there to happen? We never ask that question about in here. We never wonder, man, why would God allow me to be bad? Why would God allow me to make bad choices, to make missteps? So a question, and I know you're mostly watching at home, and so you can raise your hand if you want, but obviously I won't know the difference. So have you ever wanted to do something wrong? Um, have you ever wanted to do something wrong, but you didn't, not because you're so good, but you thought that you would get caught if you did that thing wrong? And then beyond that, maybe if you knew that there was a chance you wouldn't get caught, you probably would have done that thing. Like it was all based on whether or not you would get caught or seen doing something wrong. We have all made mistakes, and a lot of the times when we don't make mistakes, it's because there's some sort of social pressure that we're aware of, and we want to make sure that we don't look bad in front of others. But we all have these mistakes, and when people begin to wrestle with, if God is good, then why is there evil? And these types of questions, we always think about it in regards to the evil out there in the world, the big, scary, bad evil that we can all see and point to. But we never ask that question about the evil or the wrong that's in our own hearts and in our own minds. It's always this, man, why would God allow that? Um, for example, nobody ever really starts to ask the question, how could a loving or a good God allow me to happen? We never wonder, man, if there's a loving God, and why would he allow uh, bad things out there and evil out there? We never start to question, man, if there's a loving God, then why does he even allow me to happen? Nobody ever says, if God was really loving, then he would have probably done something about me by now. We always have this perspective when we look at evil and pain and suffering. We always have this perspective of it being this out there thing. We know that we're bad, but we never wonder why God allows us to continue and exist. And it sounds silly, but I think if we're honest, we get really confused and upset with the bad things that happen out there. But when it comes to what happens in here, we like to let that stuff slide. It's like, well, you know, grace, and he's loving, and that's why God allows me to continue. But why does he allow other things to continue? Why does he allow that pain to happen? Why does he allow that suffering to exist out there? Sometimes I've heard people say this phrase, that when they look at the pain or the evil or the brokenness in the world, they say something like, God is either all loving, but not all powerful. Either he wants to do something about it, but he can't, or he's all powerful, but he's not actually all loving. And we find ourselves stuck in this weird little cycle. And a lot of people have used this. And this question, this statement has really caused a lot of people to walk away from their faith, because you end up and really kind of it's like, technically it's called like a falsifiable premise. There's not a way to actually test this theory. There's not a way to test or to understand if you play it out all the way to its extreme. But I want to try and reorient kind of our understanding of God. And I want to start off in a way, and I'm going to try and maybe startle you a little bit with this sentence. And it would be this: God isn't loving. Now, we think of this idea of loving in terms of how we are loving. God is not loving. God is love. That's what it says in 1 John 4:8. The very essence of who God is love. And so for us in our humanity, we are not love. Our essence is not love. And so when we try to understand God's love and we wrestle with these questions of like pain and suffering and why do bad things happen, we think of it in terms of our own ability to be loving. Like, I can't possibly be loving and also something else. And so the reality for us is that God is love. God is noun love. And oftentimes God also verbs love, which is a weird thing. So there's this dual reality. So God can be loving, but it's not like God is choosing to be loving sometimes and not others. It's that God is love, and everything that God does flows and is tied back to and is anchored in the essence of who he is, which is love. Now, before you roll your eyes, I think that there is a significance in these two phrases. We think of it in our own ability to be loving, and it can only be, it's like a scale where it can only be balanced, but it's hard for us to shift our minds to consider that God is in actuality love. And so everything that he does or that he doesn't do is tied to that reality. It's not that the scriptures don't tell us that God is power. They say that God is powerful. They don't say that God is wisdom. It says that God is wise. And God acts in these ways. And all of these attributes of who God is, they're all tied into this core essence that God is love. And that's an important thing for us to understand. Everything that God does flows from the essence of who he is. His power flows from his love. His grace flows from a place of love. His wisdom, his creativity, God's justice flows from a place of love, because that's who he is. God's anger flows from a place of love. All of this, it is anchored in and it flows from the very essence of who God is. And so from that place, we don't wonder if God is all powerful and all loving. We believe that God is love and that his power is used and it's anchored from that place. So whenever God acts or doesn't act, it's based in the essence of who he is, which is love. Because God is love, he allows his creation the freedom to make decisions and have what I've heard call say-so in their lives. We have the ability to make decisions. We have the ability to shape things, to make choices, to have say-so over what's happening in our lives. God allows us to do this because he is love. And otherwise, he would be essentially turning us into robots. and there would be no relationship. And that's the deepest thing that God wants with us. So we have to have freedom in order to have relationship. We see this even in the creation poem. God creates Adam and Eve for relationship with each other and for relationship with him, and he gives them the choice. He asks them to not eat from this tree, but he gives them the choice to do it. And when they make this step and sin comes into the world, it causes pain and brokenness, not only in their relationship with each other and their relationship with him, but it causes pain and brokenness in the world. Ultimately, the ground was cursed because of this thing. And so it's important for us to understand that because God is love, he allows us to have freedom and say so and power and agency over our own lives. Sometimes we choose life and beauty and goodness, and sometimes we paint stolen cars Dodger blue, and it's just the most evil thing. No, this is the choice that we get. But it's not only just that I get to make this choice and you get to make this choice. There's also a reality that all of creation is broken. Creation is not as it was intended. It was not intended to have things like earthquakes and tsunamis. Creation is also broken. And besides that, there is a spiritual realm, and we believe that there is an enemy that is attacking us, and there is a spiritual war happening at the same time. So it's not just that God's up here pulling strings like a puppet master. It's that because God is love, he allowed for freedom of choices to be made, and we get to show up, and we get to choose what that looks like. That's why in Jesus' prayer, when he taught us how to pray, we spent 8 weeks on this, he said, pray like this: your will be done on heaven as it is in earth. If God was going to just decide everything that happened, we would not have to pray that prayer. It is an invitation for us to consider, how can I do the right thing? How can I bring God's will, God's kingdom to earth now? Because I play a part in this. I have freedom and say-so and agency. Because God is love, he allows his creation the freedom to make decisions. And because God is all-powerful, he is able to use even the most painful moments for good. That is where the power comes in. Because God is love, we have freedom to choose, and because of his power, no evil or darkness or pain or death can fully overcome who he is. And somehow he uses the most broken and hurting and painful situations that we've experienced, and he can cause good to come from those things. It doesn't take away the pain from those experiences, which is frustrating, but it does offer us hope in the middle of them. In the middle of the pain, in the middle of the suffering, the hope that we have is that somehow God is so powerful that he will even use these painful experiences for good in our lives and for his plan, for his purpose. There's a powerful example of this in the Gospel of John. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, these are all eyewitness accounts of the life of Jesus. And John tells this story, and it's a long passage. It's found in John chapter 11, and I'm going to be jumping around because it's like 50 verses or something like that. We don't have time to read all of them. But this is a story you may be familiar with. It's about a man named Lazarus. So we're going to start off in John chapter 11, verse 1. And I think it gives us a glimpse into the reality of God being love and also having power that shows up in our lives. So it says, now a man named Lazarus was sick. He was from Bethany, the village of Mary and her sister Martha. So the sisters sent word to Jesus, Lord, the one that you love is sick, because Jesus was friends with Lazarus and Mary and Martha. When he heard this, Jesus said, the sickness will not end in death. No, it is for God's glory, so that God's Son may be glorified through it. So there's already, he says, the sickness won't end in death, but it's for God's glory. So there's already this idea that, like, wait a second, so bad things don't automatically disprove that God is loving, that God exists, that God is here with us. There's already a little a thing here. This sickness, this evil was used by God, not caused, but used. Now, Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus. So when he heard that Lazarus was sick, he stayed where he was 2 more days. And then he said to his disciples, let's go back to Judea. This is like one of the most bizarre sentences. Jesus loved Lazarus. I can't say that name to save my life right now. Jesus loved Lazarus and Mary and Martha, and he was troubled when he was sick. And so when he found out he was sick, he stayed exactly where he was for 2 more days. This feels like there is something that doesn't make sense. Jesus was waiting, and he had a purpose and an intention for what he was going to do. Sure doesn't look like Jesus loved them because he didn't run. He didn't show up immediately. And I think sometimes we feel that same sense of it doesn't always look like God loves us because we don't see him immediately in that moment of fear or pain or brokenness. Verse 11, it goes on, it says, after he had said this, he went on to tell them, our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep, but I'm going there to wake him up. His disciples replied, Lord, if he sleeps, he will get better. It's like the ultimate Monty Python throwback. Like if he just let him sleep it off, he'll surely get better. He goes on, Jesus had been speaking of his death, but his disciples thought that he meant a natural sleep. So then he told them plainly, hey guys, Lazarus is dead. It's just to break it down for them, just point blank and clear. And what he says next, in the moment, for Mary and Martha and even Lazarus, who is dead at this point, in that moment, it was painful and not what they wanted. But for us today in 2020, for us today in the middle of a pandemic, for us today in a country that is absolutely crushed under the pain of racism and the anger and the hatred that's flowing politically, I mean, every side. For us today, this is incredibly hopeful. But in the moment, if you were to put yourselves in Mary and Martha's shoes, and it might not be that hard because it might be how you feel in this moment. Jesus says, Lazarus is dead, and for your sake, I'm glad that I was not there so that you may believe. But let us go to him. It is a difficult sentence to process. Jesus says, Lazarus is dead, and for your sake, speaking to the disciples, the people that are watching this pain unfold, says, for your sake, I'm glad that I wasn't there, so that now you get an opportunity to believe. Now you get an opportunity to see what I can do, who I am. So he says, let us go to him. Jesus gives us this example. We know the pain of life, loss, evil, death in our own stories and our own families. Jesus gives us this example so that we could see and that we could believe that it isn't an all-powerful or all-loving. It's not one versus the other. It's this different picture of the way that God shows up. In verse 20, it says, when Martha heard that Jesus was coming, she went out to meet him, but Mary stayed home. Lord, Martha said to Jesus, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. There it is. God, you could, but you didn't. You could have done something about this, but you didn't. You can feel the angst and the anger and the frustration in her statement. And we have all thought that. Every single one of us has had that experience. God, you could have, but you didn't. Some of us have maybe even said, God, you should have, and you chose not to. And we interpret that as God not wanting to, or God being unhappy with us, or God not being able to. Bad things happen to good, godly people, even Jesus' friends. Martha is upset. And then in verse 32, when Mary reached the place, she catches up. When Mary reaches the place where Jesus was and saw him, maybe Mary had a little bit more faith than Martha. She fell at his feet and said, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. Again, that same sentiment. God, you could have. If you were here, you could have done something. You should have done something. If you loved him and if you loved us the way that we thought that you loved us, this would not be the situation that we find ourselves in. Now, it's important for us to understand this and to find ourselves in this story. It goes on in verse 33, when Jesus saw her weeping and the Jews who had come along with her also weeping, he was deeply moved in spirit and troubled. "Where have you laid him?" he asked. "Come and see, Lord," they replied. Now, it's important for us to pause before I go on. In Hebrews chapter 1, it says that the Son, talking about Jesus, is the exact representation of God and the very radiance of his glory. So Jesus, we believe that Jesus is the clearest picture of who God is. We can read all of the scripture and we find ideas about who God is throughout all of the Old Testament. We find ideas of who God is throughout the New Testament. We find all these pictures and this sense of God is this way and God is that way. And those are true, but the most true, the most clear, the most authentic and honest picture of who this God is that we as Christians believe in, we get to see that in Jesus, in the way that Jesus acts. It's important for us to understand what happens in this story because this is the way that God responds when he sees pain and suffering and evil in our lives and in the world. He arrives at the tomb and God enters into the fullness of human emotion. And in verse 35, it says that Jesus wept. That's it. That's 2 words. It's this sense that there was so much happening. There was so much pain. There was so much loss. It wasn't only the sadness that Jesus felt about losing a friend, but it was also that he saw that Martha and Mary were weeping and the other people in the community. There was this recognition of the pain and the suffering and the questions and the anxiety that they were all dealing with in this moment. God saw that and he felt that the same way that you and I do, and it caused him to weep, to enter in to this reality that we all are familiar with in our own lives. And then the Jews said, "See how he loved him." But some of them said, "Could not he who opened the eyes of the blind man have kept this man from dying?" Some of them said, "Well, is God all loving or is he all powerful? Because it doesn't seem like he's both." Some of them had questions because it didn't make sense that a God that was so powerful and good and they had seen him do miracles in the past, why would he not this time? And you and I have all felt that in our lives. In that moment, Jesus took the pain and the disappointment and the loss and the anger and the unanswered prayers and the grief, and he brought something good from it. He ultimately brings life out of death, out of the grave, out of the pain. Jesus, because of his being all powerful, was able to bring something out of evil and suffering and death that nobody else could. 38, it says, Jesus, once more deeply moved, came to the tomb. "Take away the stone," he said. "But Lord," said Martha, the sister of the dead man, "by this time there is a bad odor, for he has been there 4 days." Which feels a little bit like an odd thing to include in this story. But it's interesting because as I've studied, there was this kind of understanding at this point in time that somebody was really dead after 3 days. That it took at least 3 days for a dead person's soul, for a dead person to ultimately be, absolutely, there's no coming back from this kind of dead. So there's this interesting piece here where I think that they literally wanted to use this to make us know they had no expectations, no hope. There's no way that God could redeem this because he is very dead. 4 days dead. Jesus called in a loud voice and says, "Lazarus, come out." The dead man came out. His hands and his feet were wrapped with strips of linen, and he had a cloth around his face. And Jesus says to them, "Take off the grave clothes and let him go." This is the story of Lazarus being resurrected from the dead. It's not a story about Lazarus not dying. And what's interesting is that Lazarus went on to die again in his life. It's not a story about God removing pain. It's not a story about God pulling the puppet strings to make sure that the people that he loves, even his closest friends, didn't have to experience pain or suffering. It's a story about God's deep love for us his deep understanding of humanity, of what it means to be fully human, and also because God is love, he is able to use his power to bring life out of the most painful situations. There's a few things I want us to take away from this, and I don't know what's going on in your life. I know even on our team and our staff, there's been loss and pain over the last week. Obviously, we see the chaos on the news. There are health concerns. There's protests and violence and all kinds of things happening in the world right now. It's so important for us to know that we can wrestle with these questions. It's so important for us to know that the questions and the doubts and the frustrations don't make us wrong or bad or keep us outside of a relationship with God. And so there's three statements that I think are helpful for us. And I hope that they're helpful for you, and they don't answer every question, but I think it's important for us to remember these three things. The first one is that God does not always stop pain because he wants us to have freedom. God does not always stop pain or stop suffering because he wants us to have say-so or agency or power in our life to make choices, to choose to be in a relationship with him. So God cannot stop all of the pain that we experience because in the core of who he is, of being love, he wants us to have the freedom to make our own choices. The second thing is that God doesn't avoid our pain because he wants us to have comfort. So we are going to experience it, but we don't serve or we don't believe in a God that just sits up there somewhere in this like high place and watching us be in pain. We believe that God doesn't avoid our pain, but that he actually steps into the suffering with us. In this story, literally weeping at the graveside with us. God doesn't avoid our pain because he wants us to feel a sense of comfort in knowing that he experienced pain, many ways pain that we will never know, that he understands it and that he is with us in it. That is one of the greatest threads throughout all of the scripture, is that God is with us in the midst of the pain and chaos and unknown of life. In 2 Corinthians, Paul is writing to a church and he says it this way. He says, "Praise be to the God, the Father of compassion, and the God of all comfort, who comforts us in our troubles, so that we can comfort those in any trouble with the comfort that we ourselves receive from God." So there's this deep rooted idea of the comfort that God wants us to have from him, and then the way that we are able to sit and stand alongside other people to help comfort them. The third thing I think is important for us to hold on to is that God doesn't ignore pain because he wants us to have hope. And what I mean by that is God doesn't just write it off as, well, that was bad. Let's move on. Well, that was incredibly painful. Let's just move on. That was evil. Let's just move on. God doesn't ignore pain because he wants us to have hope. And so over and over and over again, God, because he is love and because he is all powerful, he takes the most dark and painful and hurtful and sad and frustrating experiences that we can have, and he brings life or goodness out of it in some way. And I know if you are sitting in pain right now, that might not make you feel better. It doesn't take away the pain. It doesn't make suffering less difficult. It still hurts. It still is painful. It is still angering. We still experience all of these things, but it allows us to hold on to a sense of hope. Otherwise, it is just pain after pain. And there is nothing that comes from the pain. And there is nothing that comes from the suffering. And there's nothing that could even be accomplished because of what happens in the world around us. We would be utterly without hope. And so God doesn't ignore the pain because he wants us to have hope. So he sees it, he steps in to comfort us. He allows us the freedom to navigate through it. And he says, because of this experience, even in spite of this experience, I'm going to bring good through this. This is a difficult thing to understand. And again, especially if you're sitting in a seat right now experiencing pain and wondering and wrestling with these questions. In Genesis, there's a story about a man named Joseph, and I can't tell the whole story because I know you guys are already thinking about lunch, and that's okay. There's a story about a man named Joseph, and I think maybe more than anybody else in the Bible, Joseph just had this series of unfortunate events is being too kind. It was just one catastrophe after another, and none of them were his fault. He did the right thing every time, and it just seemed like more and more and more pain. And there's this line at the end of his story, and we're actually going to talk about it in a few months, but there's this line at the end of his story, and Joseph says this line that is so good. He says, "What the world meant for evil, God used for good." What the world meant to hurt, what the world meant to control, what the world meant to cause pain or to cause suffering or divide, what the world meant, God used it for good. It's not that God caused it, it's that He is so powerful that He's like, I can even take that crap that you are dealing with. I can take the suffering, I can take the questions and the doubt, and I can even make something good out of that. That is the kind of powerful God that we serve. That is what it looks like for us. The easiest way in my own life that I've been able to see this kind of from a 50,000 foot view as I think about growing up. My family, it was, for a lot of years, it was a loving and great family. And then again, the Cliff Note version is we just hit this incredibly difficult season. There was a lot of anger and fear. There was abuse. There was a lot of pain. Ultimately, my parents ended up getting divorced. I grew up in North Carolina. All of the pain of divorce, all of the fear of what was happening, all of the unknowns, all of the questions. And then we moved to California, to the beautiful beachside, like movie-like town of Corona, California. I had all of the questions and none of it made sense. And I knew that it wasn't that God wanted any of that stuff to happen. God didn't cause any of that stuff to happen, but it hurt. But now, 20 plus years later, I get to look at my life. I get to look at my kids and my wife that I would have never known if I stayed in North Carolina. I get to look at what I feel like God's called me to do and the abilities that He's given me and the relationships that I have. I wouldn't have any of this except God took something that was insanely painful and wrong and broken, and He caused good to come out of even that. That is the hope that we hold on to. It does not make it hurt less when you're in it. But it's not a false dichotomy of either God is all loving or all powerful. It is that God is love, and because of His deep love for us and because of His power, He is able to work even in the midst of the most painful situations, and He can bring good from it. So when we're faced with a situation where we think, where are you, God? You could have done something about this if you wanted to, like Martha and Mary asked. It's an invitation for us not to accuse God of not wanting to, but it's an invitation for us to recognize that God is love and that He is with us in the midst of pain, that He is not the one that is causing the pain, and the hope that we get to hold on to is that He can cause good to come out of even the darkest times in our lives. Let's bow our heads and pray together.